This is the Resistance Report for April 24th, 2017. Good evening. Tonight we have a special report because I am very, very privileged and delighted to have two guests here who are heading up one of the most important grassroots efforts in the United States, in the resistance to Donald Trump, but also in terms of building momentum for the progressive cause that is not just resistance, but also a positive force for change in America. On my right, Ezra Levin. On my left, Leah Greenberg. And Ezra and Leah are the founders of the Indivisible project. That is indivisible.guide.com, or however you guys want to describe it.
That's exactly right, yeah.
What is the name of this effort officially?
So officially it is Indivisible Project. Leah actually coined not the term, it actually is just an English word, but she used it to describe the guide, which is this Google Doc that we put online 4 months ago and has grown into, surprisingly, a full-fledged organization now, a nonprofit.
It's only been 4 months?
It's only been 4 months. We put the document online a week before Christmas.
Now the document we're talking about is indivisibleguide.com. That's where it's found. And I have been touting your document, but many, many other people have as well, because it is probably the best tool around for organizing and influencing members of Congress. How did you come up with it?
Well, we were actually both former congressional staffers. We served during the early years of the Obama administration, and we saw during that time the rise of the Tea Party. We saw this force of local activists become a really powerful force in American politics, and really reshaped the map of what was possible in the early Obama years. And we worked for progressive Democrats, so we watched that in horror. But after the election of Donald Trump, we realized that there was maybe a lesson we could take from it.
And is the lesson that the Tea Party was able to do things because they knew how to organize? But, one counterfactual might be that the Tea Party was co-opted by big money, by Koch brothers and others. But is that correct? How do you view that?
So, what we saw out there, without a doubt, the Koch brothers had an influence on the Tea Party, and certainly later on in the life of the Tea Party really affected the actions it took. But early on, there was there were folks on the ground who were disgruntled conservatives who, in reaction to the election of Barack Obama, came out and started finding each other. So there was real grassroots energy out there, and although we didn't agree with the racism or the violence, we thought that they got strategy and tactics really right. And it's not rocket science. This is local defensive congressional advocacy implemented with Civics 101 tactics, going to local district offices, going to town hall events, making calls. It's not difficult to do, but it was effective. They took a president who was historically popular with huge congressional majorities, and they didn't win everything, but they were able to stall or in some cases defeat large parts of his agenda. The progressives, after this past election, although we were beat, we didn't face the same, and we don't face the same challenge. We have a historically unpopular president with minuscule margins in the House and the Senate. We can use these strategies and tactics.
So the Tea Partiers, at the start of the Obama administration, they went into Republican primaries. They focused on Republican primaries, and they pushed the incumbents to either become more radically right, or they supported challengers that were more radical to the right. Do you see this, that is, Indivisible Guide, or the Indivisible Project, as the equivalent of a kind of Tea Party on the left? Or if not, what's the difference?
Yeah, so I actually think that there are a couple ways to resist the Trump administration's agenda. You can fight on the legislative front, or you can fight on the electoral front, or you can do both. And what we see these indivisible groups doing is both. So we are fighting for the Congressional Ethics Office, not just because it makes Republicans look bad and it's going to help us set up 2018 to be a win for us, but because we should have a Congressional Ethics Office. That's important. So that's a fight worth having.
Above and beyond the question of tactics and strategy, it's important to have.
That's right.
You believe in government
And ethics,
and ethics rather than just tactics that put people in power.
That's right. And the same is true of Trump Care. The same is true when we're fighting against some of the nominees that are extreme that he's put up. These are important fights to have because they have an impact on people's lives. Now, it is also true that you can change who is writing the legislation. You can change the folks who are actually in power, and that's when electoral politics comes into play. So we now have 6,000 indivisible groups that have registered across the country. That's at least 2, and an average of 13 in every single congressional district in the country.
Let me pause there, because I want to repeat that. There's 6,000 indivisible groups in just 4 months, and at least 2 in every congressional district in the country, and sometimes up to, did you say 13?
Well, it's an average of 13. The up to is dozens. We're talking right now in Berkeley, California. I think there are probably 2 dozen within 3 rooms of us right now.
Well, but that raises the most obvious next question, which is, if you have indivisible groups in blue districts, what, some people might say, well, what good does that do? I mean, we already have the Congress that we, as blue districts, want. How can the blue district indivisible groups help the purple district or even the red district indivisible group?
Well, we would say that everybody has an important role to play, because there are very few people out there who have 3 members of Congress who are your member of Congress and your 2 senators who are all doing everything they can to resist the Trump agenda. And we intended, when we wrote the guide, for it to be equally useful for advocating to Republicans and for stiffening Democratic spines, and we think that that's a really important part.
Stiffening Democratic spines is obviously clearly important. In my experience, it's also important to congratulate Democrats who are doing it right, because even the ones from blue districts, they have to raise money, and they have to raise money often, they feel, from some wealthy people or from corporations. So to do it right, they've got to stand up a little bit and have some backbone. So it's necessary to push them and thank them.
And what we've seen, so we're former congressional staff, there aren't that many people who come to you and tell you thank you. Most of the time you're hearing from people who are mad at you when you're in a congressional office. So it's actually really powerful to recognize your congressman when they're standing up and doing something good.
And how is it possible for people to get the information? That is, are you providing people with the information they need to know whether their members of Congress are doing something good and deserve to be congratulated or pushed or whatever?
Yes, we are. So we actually continue to do regular updates on whatever is happening in Congress, on major policy priorities. We provide information on if you want to call your member of Congress about a specific issue, here are some of the things that you can tell them when you're calling. We update that information on a daily basis.
Daily? Now, we've had 2 weeks of congressional recess. You guys and Indivisible, the Indivisible Project, indivisibleguide.com, you've had an enormous impact just in these recesses in terms of helping people organize to either thank or confront or give backbone to their members of Congress. I mean, what?
So congressional recess we view as a real opportunity for folks to make their voices heard. So we call it congressional recess. That's a colloquial term, though. If you look at a congressional calendar, it's actually called in-district work period, because the members of Congress are expected to go back to their districts, which is their states or their home districts, and do work, which is to say listen to their constituents. So there aren't votes, there aren't hearings, they're going back home, and they should be holding town halls and public events to listen. Now, some members of Congress aren't doing that. They're hiding from their constituents because they're afraid to stand up for the Trump administration's agenda, although they are voting for it. But nonetheless, we are seeing people make their voices heard. So they are going to the town halls when they exist, or they're holding their own town halls and inviting the member of Congress and giving them a platform, saying, you can come and speak to several hundred of us. And if you come, you'll have a mic. If not, we'll have a cardboard cutout of you. Or in a case in Wisconsin, I think somebody brought a live chicken on stage to represent
that chicken is very, very good. I mean, that represents a lot of people
in Washington.
In Washington. But how do you, I mean, I get complaints, we get complaints that there are members, particularly in red states and red districts, that say that they're going to have town halls, but now are getting scared off and don't want to even show their face.
So this is, I mean, we saw this be actually a pretty effective strategy even in red districts. So Trump Care is a great example. So the
Trump Care, we're talking about
Trump Care, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, the effort to take away health insurance from 24 million Americans. Brilliant idea. doesn't have a lot of support. It was falling at 17%, in part because people were showing up and saying, I will be dead or bankrupt if you take away the Affordable Care Act. Now, folks were saying that in blue districts, sure, but they were saying that in deep red districts in states like Arkansas, where I'm from Texas, you saw people with thick Southern accents standing up and telling Senator Tom Cotton, you cannot take this away from me. But most importantly to us, it's not just about signaling that you care about this. It's not about just the symbolic value of standing up and telling your story. We saw what was politically possible at the national level change as a direct result of people showing up in districts like Representative Freeland-Hyson in New Jersey, or Representative Lance, also in New Jersey, or Representative Comstock in Virginia. These were folks who were going to district offices and holding their own town hall events because their members of Congress weren't listening to them, but they got the message. These were the representatives who ultimately dropped off of Trump care and sunk it, so it didn't even get a vote.
One of the things that we point out to people is even if your member of Congress is avoiding you, every single member of Congress every morning, a junior staff member compiles a listing of all of the press clips that their name appeared in the day before. So that means that if you have staged your own event and it's been covered in local media, whether or not they are talking to you, they are getting the message.
So, Leah, how do you get it covered in local media? That nexus between local activism and local media and the member of Congress is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we actually have a toolkit specifically focused on that.
Yeah.
There are some simple steps for how to reach out to local media, how to get your message out, how to do letters to the editor or a letter to the editor campaign. There are a lot of different ways to bring local media to understand what you're trying to tell them. And one big story is member of Congress is avoiding their constituents. That's a big deal.
So local media during these two, what we call colloquially recess periods, the last 2 weeks and the one before, have the local media been reporting on the avoiders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are a lot of local press clips about members of Congress who are not meeting with their constituents.
I mean, if you want to get just a jolt of energy every morning, I recommend you sign up for a Google alert for Indivisible, and you'll see all of the local press hits every morning, and they are, name the small town with an Indivisible group that held a town hall last weekend, and the member of Congress didn't show, or they did show, and folks talked about how they were being negatively impacted by Trump's administration. So it is happening, it is working, and the reason why it's working is, in addition to getting news clips every morning, every member of Congress wakes up thinking, how am I going to get reelected? And the answer to that question is, I'm going to craft my local image very carefully, and I'm going to project the image to my constituents that I am representing them. And they do that by actually listening to the constituents, and if they're not listening to the constituents, they're going to get negative press, and that's going to alter their political calculus.
Now, what happens if a member of Congress says publicly, look, this Indivisible crowd, they're just a bunch of Democrats, and they're just loud Democrats, and they don't really reflect my constituents, and you, local media, nobody else should pay attention to them. How do we, first of all, A, is that true? B, if it's not true, how do you rebut that?
Yeah, so I mean, this was somewhat surprising for us, because in order to register an Indivisible group, you have to actually affirmatively say your group will model progressive values. But people are signing up, forming these groups in Indivisible East Tennessee, or Indivisible Oklahoma, or Indivisible Ozarks in Arkansas, or Indivisible Auburn, Alabama, and they're not just Democrats. This administration is so far outside the bounds of what is normal that you have a lot of Republicans and independents who are upset with the Republican Party for not acting as a check on this administration, and so they are mobilizing under the Indivisible banner as well. That said, any member of Congress who dismisses an entire, thousands of their constituents just because they belong to the other party is also open to pretty reasonable critique. They are not elected to represent just their Republican constituents. They are elected to represent all of their constituents.
Which brings us to, I guess, one of the questions I have has to do with the actual primaries coming up. I mean, the primaries are coming up, let's say in some places are about 10 months away. What are you doing or encouraging people to do in the primaries? Let's say Republican primaries. I mean, what do you have a guide coming out for Republicans in Republican primaries who would like to push their members of Congress to the more moderate middle?
Yeah. So no, it's a great idea. So we don't have that guy. Maybe this is something we should look into. So I would say two things. One is that the work that folks are doing right now, today, to push back against Trump care, or to push back against cuts in the budget, or to push back against regressive tax quote-unquote reform, that is important work to do regardless of what happens in the election next year. These are important fights to have because they have an impact on people's lives. That said, this work that folks are doing in communities, building up these groups, is work that's setting them up to have an impact in 2018 and in the elections that are happening this year. So we don't have a guide out yet, although we're only 3 months old. But we don't have a guide out yet that's here's how you should.
You've had all this time,
right?
For 3 months.
We do have actually, I will say we have a ton of resources. So in addition to the guide itself, the original guide, there's a Spanish language version of the guide. There's a video with you that's on our website on the importance of town halls. That's excellent. And then we have a ton of scripts and toolkits and explainers, so that if folks want to make their voice heard, we're trying to demystify Congress so they can do that. We're just now starting to build out a political program too, so that we can get involved in the electoral side, because that's a key piece of the puzzle. We need to change the folks who have power, not just try to argue with the folks who are doing the wrong things with that power today.
By the way, this is indivisibleguide.com, and I am here with Ezra Levin and Leah Greenberg, the founders of the Indivisible Project, who are also, although it's a flat organization, you tell me, still very much not in control, but running things. You're not running things, you're just guiding things.
We're part of the team.
We're part of the team.
You're in an indivisible guide. Where did the name come from, Leah? The Indivisible. I mean, I know where the name comes from in our founding documents, but why indivisible?
2 reasons. The first was we were thinking about the power of symbols and iconography and being rooted in the American experience and American history, and that's sort of how I thought about Indivisible as part of the Pledge of Allegiance, as being very rooted in that American tradition. But it also expresses a belief that we are really clear about in the guide, which is that we all have to stand up for each other right now. The foundations of American democracy are under attack, and in particular, this administration is targeting the most vulnerable members of society, and we have to treat an attack on one as an attack on all, and that's not just, that is a moral principle, but it's also about the best strategy for going forward, because we think that the best way to protect the environment right now was to fight on health care, so that when Trump came for the environment, he was in a weaker position to do so. We think that every issue is linked, and we have to take them all together in order to win.
And that notion of every issue being linked, I think is exactly right. And very often we are in the habit, particularly those of us on the progressive side of the ledger, of having interest groups that are organized around particular issues and not across a bunch of issues. One thing that I'm intrigued at with regard to the kind of national emerging organizations, grassroots that you guys are fomenting, is the ability to take on a lot of interrelated issues, not just the environment, not just healthcare, not just immigration, but actually see that they are all part of a interlocking, interlaced set of justice issues.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's not just us. We'd love to take credit for it, but the energy out there is what is driving this. After the election, we saw folks, maybe they were environmental activists, or that's what the issue they cared about. Maybe they cared most about reproductive rights, or maybe they cared most about the progressive tax code. But in response to this election, they wanted to respond with their whole selves. And we think, again, that is the morally responsible thing to do, because the most vulnerable members of society are under attack by this administration and Congress. But strategically, it is also really important, because the alternative is to wait your turn for your issue and then lose. The only way we're actually going to be able to effectively resist, as Leah said, is to stand up for the environment, even if you're a reproductive rights advocate. Stand up for the progressive tax code, even if you're in there for the dreamers. That is the best way to accomplish our goals together. And I will say, it has panned out pretty well so far. We have
Remarkably,
seen people come out.
yeah, remarkably well so far. Which gets me to my next question, and that is, how do you maintain the enthusiasm? I mean, we've been doing the Resistance Report almost every night. People are tuning in. People are outraged by the Trump administration. But how do you avoid the inevitable sort of outrage exhaustion? Sort of the point at which people say, I'm exhausted and I'm numb or the normalization that is going on. I mean, you can almost feel every time Trump does something that is even halfway reasonable. All of a sudden you've got a lot of people coming and say, "Well, he's not really that bad. He's in a new moderate phase."
Right. So this is the number one question we're facing. And look, this is why we started the organization to begin with. We put out a Google Doc, and at the very bottom of that first page of the Google Doc, we say we are not professional organizers. We are not starting an organization. And then we started an organization in January, and it was to support these groups, the 6,000 groups that have come together. It is a tough job if you started with 20 people in your living room and suddenly you have 1,500 people in a community center. How do you ensure that that energy goes forward? Because the story 2 years from now cannot be, remember that time in early 2017 when we all did activism for a while. If that's the story about how we lost. That's the story about how Trump succeeded. So providing the trainings, providing the connectivity, building a sense of shared identity and shared purpose among these groups. That's what we're trying to do through the Indivisible project.
So let's talk about, I'm sorry.
What we're seeing so far is that things are not slowing down. So there were 250 events around the country in February for the first recess, and there were 450 this recess. So if you're worried about the momentum slowing anytime soon, we're not.
Well, Trump is likely to keep on doing outrageous things, so that, I mean, to that extent, momentum is going to be there. But going back to the point about organization and momentum and the relationship between them, do you have a means of linking up the indivisible groups, the 6,000, and is there a thought about creating a national organization, not a replacement for the Democratic Party necessarily, but a national organization that has its own integrity and heft?
Well, so, I mean, one thing that we are not doing through the Indivisible project is actually linking directly with the Democratic Party. We are not an arm of the Democratic Party, and we're not coordinating with them, and we actually think that is important that there's an independent body. Look, 15 Democrats voted for Mike Pompeo, a man who slanders Muslim Americans, who's open to torture, who endorses surveillance of Americans, and 15 Democrats voted for him. And we were happy that there were indivisible groups outside of Dianne Feinstein's office and Chuck Schumer's office and Amy Klobuchar's office saying, do not vote for this man's nominees. 2 weeks later, 0 Democrats voted for Betsy DeVos. Now, Betsy DeVos is awful, don't get me wrong. She is not so much worse than Mike Pompeo for CIA director. The difference was people showed up. It is important to have folks who are making sure that progressives are actually progressives and do what they can to resist. Through the Indivisible project, we're trying to set up structures at the community level. That's what this is. These are independently led, community level progressive infrastructure that can serve as a way for folks to get involved and, yes, engage in local defensive congressional advocacy, but also get involved in state and local, also get involved in elections.
I think it's very, very important not to be part of the Democratic Party. I think that gives you an integrity and also an independence that is vitally necessary, and I think it's far from clear that the Democratic Party is going to reinvent itself or reform itself. I wouldn't want to bet on it right now. I think I'm much more eager to bet on grassroots groups, indivisible groups. I want to make sure that we have time for any questions that have come in. So let me just take a couple of questions. We can keep going here. I have a lot of questions. This is from Edgar Rodriguez. How can we keep the Democratic Party united for the next presidential election in 2020? What should we do? And Edgar presumably is talking about we being those of us who either are progressives and are indivisible groupies.
Well, I think,
go ahead.
I'll say I think the best way to have a great 2020 is to have a great 2018 first. So I think that the first focus has to be on what do we need to do to be set up for a successful 2018 election.
Do you think that it is really possible? Now let me play devil's advocate, because some people come to me and say the idea of flipping the House is going to be incredibly difficult because you've got a lot of entrenched Republicans who are there in safe districts, and on top of that you've got gerrymandering, which makes them even safer, and it's going to be very hard to uproot them. There are very few competitive districts, and in the Senate, most of the senators who are up for re-election are Democrats, and the Democrats have an inherent disadvantage because of those numbers. So what do you honestly think are the odds of flipping either the House or the Senate or both? Either of you?
Well, It's not going to be easy, but if you look at what happened in Georgia 6, there was a 6-point swing in the Democrats' favor. If there was a 6-point swing in 2018 across the board, you would be looking at 60 lost Republican seats.
Okay,
All
that's
plus 5 district.
That's really an important point. So if you look at Georgia's 6th, where we came narrowly, I mean, he almost won.
Yep.
You're saying that if there was that kind of showing or that kind of margin around the country, Republicans would be in trouble. Democrats would actually be taking over the House.
If there were that kind of swing, if there were half of that kind of swing, they would lose the House. So it's not a sure thing, but it is doable. So we are encouraged by what happened in Georgia 6. And the question is, can we maintain that kind of momentum? I would push even further. The best way to have a good 2020 is to have a good 2018. The best way to have a good 2018 is to have a good 2017. So there is work to be done right now, building up this infrastructure at the community level.
And when you say infrastructure at the community level, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're talking about not just people getting together and calling themselves an indivisible group, but actually developing a very specific agenda with regard to issues and 2018 midterms, linking up maybe on a voluntary basis with other groups, linking up with purple if they're in red districts or blue districts, maybe linking up together.
And creating plans for registering people to vote from now until the election, creating plans for endorsing candidates, and creating plans for doing GOTV, get out the vote for these candidates. I think there's a lot of work to be done now to have a successful 2018 a few months from now.
Let's have another question. We have just a few minutes left. Sherry Brooks, what is the work to do right now? Going to rallies, calling my members of Congress, what else?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's calling members of Congress, there's going to their events, there's a couple of big important moments coming up just in the next week, the People's Climate March this weekend, and then the May Day protests for immigrants, which will be happening around the country on Monday. And then more broadly, just continuing to stay engaged, remembering that this is it's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
And so I would say also, if you go to indivisibleguy.com, you can type in your zip code and find an Indivisible group near you. That's how you can join up. So I really do think the best possible thing you can do is in-person action. Calls are great, signing petitions are all well and good, but the thing that really gets your member of Congress's attention is if you show up at a district office or a town hall, and the way you do that is by coming together in your community physically with your fellow members. Maybe they're members of Indivisible groups or other parts of the resistance. That's great. But coming together physically is how it starts. And if you start doing that today, this weekend, then you can build on that in the weeks to come.
And when you say build on it, I mean, I want to make sure that people who are watching have a sense of what you're talking about. Because, Leah, you were talking about demonstrations and actions. And Ezra, you were talking about actually visits to individual members' offices. Not that those are two different things, but they're slightly different emphases. That is, in my experience, progressives have been pretty good at demonstrating. I mean, we love to march, and the Women's March was a big success in terms of people feeling charged up. But there is a connection, or sometimes lack of connection, between demonstrating and actually taking effective political action, being strategic.
And so this was at the heart of the guide that we originally wrote. So I think the Women's March was a huge success and changed the conversation. It had great symbolic value. Got a lot of people engaged for the first time. That's great. But what we focus on the guide is how can you actually assert your constituent power? And that is about going in person to your district offices, the congressional district offices, going to public events and telling your members of Congress, your 2 senators and your representative, this is what you want to see them do. And that is very effective. Now, the way to best do that is to be responsive. Now, the hard truth for progressives right now at the federal level, we don't have the House, the Senate, or the presidency. That means we do not have the ability to set the agenda. What we have the ability to do is to respond. A typical, and I say this as a former congressional staffer, a typical congressional staffer's attention span is roughly 3 minutes. If you go in talking about something that's months down the line, it's going to be in one ear and out the other. But if you go in and say, I know your boss is going to vote for something this Thursday, or I know about the hearing this Friday, you should take this action, that's what's impactful. So if the question is, what do you do today? The answer is get together with your group at the community level and figure out what is Congress voting on today? What is Congress voting on this week? That's what you should be focusing on.
And the indivisibleguide.com, you are actually providing information on what is happening in Congress, what members are actually voting on, so that people can see what is happening. What is in that 3-minute attention span? Is that right?
Yes, we have a calendar. It tells you what's happening and what you can be calling about every day.
And if you want to sign up, we don't send a ton of emails, but every Monday morning you'll get an email that says this is what's happening in Congress this week, and here are some new materials. Put in your email. We won't blast you with spam.
Well, we are going to have to wind up, but let me do this. Let me just thank both of you, Leah Greenberg, Ezra Levin. I want to, on the basis of what I know and what I've seen, and also on the premise that the only way we are going to fight back to regain control of our democracy is through grassroots efforts like you have launched. Let me just compliment and give you great kudos, because I don't know what we would do without you guys. You are not the only ones, by the way, out there.
Absolutely.
I very often plug other organizations that are doing important stuff, but you can see you're at the head in terms of my plug. Also, swingleft.org is doing some very complimentary things. Sister District is being created, and runforsomething.net is very, very important.
Absolutely.
So, again, my thanks to Ezra and to Leah. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you, all of you out there, for your continued activism. And this is the end of tonight's Resistance Report. We'll see you tomorrow.